There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19.
Furnished by the National Association of Broadcasters and this podcast.
For the Miami Wave, the 1994 NCL season is a simple equation. Win the last 4 races and the conference title is theirs. Miami is led today by the one-man wrecking crew, Brian McDonough. They're seeking an NCL title to call their own. The road to that title begins north of the border. It's War on Wheels next on The Deuce. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Toronto, Ontario, Canada for the NCL race between the Toronto Pride, Forza Milano, and the Miami Wave. I'm Jamie Smith alongside Alexi Graywall. Alexi, Toronto is halfway through their freshman year. Do you think they'll get a passing grade?
They're going to struggle for once. They've been struggling really a lot in the openers. Almost looked hopeless, but this is a big chance for them to regroup. They're on their home course. They're in front of a home crowd. And they've really got to show us today whether they can stack up. They have the stuff to stack it up with them.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, friends. It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. How are you? All things being equal, I hope you're doing all right. I hope you're staying healthy. I hope you're being safe. I hope you're doing all the things that your local officials are telling you to stop in its tracks, this crazy disease that we're all sort of dealing with as a country and the economic repercussions. And I think we're in it for the kind of the long haul, but I trust that all of you are doing the right and safe and smart things with you and your loved ones and doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing in helping keep this disease down to at least a minimum as possible and helping others out as they might need it, because it's absolutely trying times. And hopefully you're all taking it seriously and more importantly, helping others too, who for whatever reasons may need your support, counsel, and or just good deeds. So please pass that around. And, you know, as we try not to linger too much, we want to try to provide you a bit of distraction, perhaps productive distraction at that. We all know that a lot of you are hunkered down and doing your best to keep distant socially, challenging as that might be as human beings. But God forbid we can help fill your void of sports with our little silly program, which we call, of course, Good Seats Still Available. It's our curious little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. Very interesting over the last couple of weeks. Some very interesting spikes in listenership. We appreciate if you're new to the proceedings, as well as all the great commentary inbound to us. Numerous people saying, helping them get through, believe it or not, trying times and or just sheer boredom and the absence of sports by somehow stumbling across stories or adventures, things that they maybe faintly remember from their childhoods or in earlier parts of their lives, or maybe just newly discovered. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. We've seen a lot of social sharing, if you will, at least online, of our episodes and the stories and stuff. And we're heartened by all of that. And again, if we're providing a bit of respite from all the other ills and travails of our lives out there, we're doing at least something there. And hopefully that is the case. And this week's a very interesting episode, and frankly, perhaps a primer for those brand new to our little show, our little passion, our little arguably our little obsession, I guess, with teams and leagues of yore, no longer with us or previously domiciled or incarnated. And our guest this week, his name is Tom Brucato, and he has come out now with a second edition of a book that has essentially become kind of a Torah for us. It's called Major Sports Leagues. It is newly published by our friends at St. Johann Press, and it is available. I'm not sure it's immediately available on Amazon, of course, because of their prioritization of more essential needs for people using the Amazon service. But it is directly available at St. John's Press's website. And we'll give you all those details in a little while. But in essence, let me sort of set this up. This is essentially the sort of key reference point for our genre here. This is a work that Tom has done, put together. It's been almost 20 years now. And it literally is a litany and comprehensive at that, mostly comprehensive, of all of the teams and the leagues and the team names and the team name origins of all of pro sports in the United States, dating all the way back to the earliest days of Major League Baseball. We'll get into perhaps some of the reasons why Tom sort of decided to devote part of his non-professional life to putting this book into print, and the sheer monstrosity of research that's necessary, or was necessary, and still is necessary, frankly, to keep up with all of it. And a lot of it, of course, sort of traverses pro, sports that we all know are very deep and rich in history in team sports, such as basketball and football and baseball and hockey, soccer, certainly. But also, frankly, teams from leagues that in sports that you may not have even known had pro sports league setups. For example, polo, martial arts, rodeo we get into, rugby. There's obviously Major League Rugby today, but there's been a rugby league in the past as well. Tennis has been a team sport, both of current World Team Tennis, but also the original World Team Tennis. Volleyball, softball, lacrosse, both indoor and outdoor. Did you know that there were 2 leagues devoted to team play in golf in the United States? We talked about bowling. There have been 2, one of which we explored in a previous episode around the National Bowling League as well. Cricket has had its shot in 2004. And that little clip that you heard at the beginning is from something in the world of cycling, if you can believe it. Yes, in it was for a number of years, the National Cycle League from 1989 to 96. And that clip that you heard there was from a presentation on ESPN2, The Deuce, that was from 1994. That, was the way that they did these competitions, the NCL, at least that year, was not only 2 teams competing with each other, but 3 teams. The Toronto Pride, in this case, the home team, the Miami Wave, and Forza Milano, the 3 teams in this game, this match, this event in 94 from ESPN2. We tried our darndest to figure out what the actual date of that competition was. But Jamie Smith on the call and Alexi Graywall on the color commentary. And perhaps if we can somehow get in touch with Jamie Smith, who I know has done a lot of writing about cycling, both pro and amateur, both positive and not so. We'd love to get into the National Cycle League, but that's certainly something that is encompassed in this great book, Major Sports Leagues, with our guest this week, Tom Brucato. And we're going to get into all of it, sort of the generalities of all these teams and leagues that have sort of come and gone, the sort of essence of why and how these sort of things come about. We get into the process, frankly, of learning about these things, and frankly, not all of them very easily understood and discovered, even in this internet age. And obviously, Tom started this process back in the 90s when, the internet wasn't sort of a universal and broadband-enabled thing that, had sort of a cornucopia of stuff. There's plenty of nooks and crannies out there in pro sports history that eludes us even in the internet age. And that's why this book exists. And frankly, as you'll hear from Tom in a couple of moments, is a living, breathing thing, because there's always new nuggets that are being discovered. But I will tell you that this is about as comprehensive of a work you'll find for your reference shelves, but also, frankly, something that's going to obviously continue to go. We or change or morph over time. We somewhat jokingly on our Twitter feed call them future episode watch postings, right? Because there are teams and leagues, and we may be at a point of peak sports, and especially given some not so certain economic times in the months and years ahead. There could be a little bit of a loosening or a lessening of the just sheer upward spiral, I guess, of pro sports, and 30 teams in Major League Soccer, and how many teams in NHL now. And at some point cyclically that probably has to correct. But regardless of that, we're not rooting for teams and leagues to sort of go belly up. But there's a long history as we've sort of painfully explored over the last 3 years. And the themes sort of come and stick around, right? They certainly ebb and flow, but leagues and teams, businesses and business enterprise, a lot of people thinking that these are going to be the next big thing, and for whatever reasons, greed or macroeconomics sort of getting in the way and undermining sort of the most noble of ideas. But those things aren't going away. And this absolutely directly applies to pro sports. And here is a great excuse to kind of get into sort of a nice survey here of some of the teams and leagues that some of which you may know about, some of which we've already explored, and frankly, a whole bunch that you never knew existed. And we thoroughly love learning about all those new things that somehow eluded us in our lives and, frankly, in our past research. And that's what we're up to this week with our guest, Tom Brucato, coming up in just a few moments' time. We encourage you to listen heartily, and I think you'll enjoy it. By the way, also, if you listen carefully, we'll have a couple of trivia questions along the way during the breaks of the show this week. And you out there in listener land can win a free copy of Tom's book, Major Sports Leagues, published by St. Johann Press. It is an impressive work. It costs something in the neighborhood of $40. It's hardcover. It's, how many pages is this book? It goes on and on. It's almost 500 pages, my God. And it's a tremendous thing to have on your reference shelf. And like I said, we're going to have a couple of trivia questions out there. And just listen for the instructions. Listen, and we'll basically do what we call sort of the fastest finger first. The first email that we get to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com with the answer to one of those questions will receive a free copy courtesy of St. Johann Press. And Dave Beizell and his team there in Haworth, New Jersey will be glad to send you a copy. We're going to have 2 of those out there. So give a listen to this show and the trivia questions to come. And, of course, send us an email with your answer. And away we'll go. All right, before we get there, we want to say hello and welcome to our friends at one of our great sponsors, of course, been with us for a long period of time, and we love every chance to promote them. It's called Streaker Sports. Streaker Sports, they call themselves the purveyor of sports culture, and you can find more about them at streakersports.com, and make sure, of course, that you use the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases. The promo code is Good Seats. And it's the perfect excuse to try out streakersports.com because we're going to be talking about lots of defunct leagues today and the teams within them. And I can't think of, frankly, a more comprehensive site that has all the great T-shirts with all the great logos of many, not all. I mean, it's ridiculously comprehensive how many teams and leagues of yore have been out there. But, streakersports.com, using promo code Good Seats for 10% off, will be probably one of your best places that you can find just many of those leagues in one place. The American Basketball Association, the Major Indoor Lacrosse League, the Old North American Soccer League, Pro Beach Hockey, Roller Hockey International, the USFL Football League, the WFL Football League, the WHA, and also the Western Hockey League. That was sort of the Western pro equivalent of the NHL before they decided the NHL did to finally expand to the West Coast. All of those leagues are represented in fantastic T-shirt form, and they're just well created, the great quality, and you will find, I guarantee, you're going to go through all these teams and you're going to go, wow, didn't know about that one, or oh my God, I forgot about them. And it's all there for you under the Defunct Leagues tab at streakersports.com. Again, promo code Good Seats, 10% off all of your purchases. And while you're there, check out all the other great stuff that they got too. Fantastic stuff that's sports related and sports inspired and all kinds of really great stuff. And no better way to kind of sort of fill the gap and the void of not having actual pro sports to watch, or college sports for that matter, by maybe reminiscing about some of the times in the good old days when your favorite team or league was up and running. Again, one more time, it's streakersports.com, and the promo code for you is Good Seats, 10% off all of your purchases. Thank you, Streaker Sports. We love your patronage of this little show, and we appreciate all of you out there in listener land giving them a look, giving them a consideration, maybe making a purchase, helping another small business out there. And while you're doing that, as you kick back and relax, please enjoy our conversation about major sports leagues. Yeah, it's the book and the topic with our new pal, Tom Brucato. And here's our chat. Please enjoy. Maybe you can give our audience a little bit of a sense of, before we get into perhaps maybe a bit of our shared malady here, a little bit of background about sort of who you are by day, and then maybe we can skate into the more serious topic at hand, of course.
Okay, well, by day I do not have a very interesting job, although it is a writing job. I work in technical writing for a division of United Healthcare called United Medical Resources. And my job is in quality assurance. I basically am checking the quality of our plan documents that go to plan members that are covered by these insurance and self-insured plans.
Well, I mean, but that sounds to me like attention to detail, right? Which sounds like it could also be very helpful for what we're going to be talking about. Well, all right, so I'm going to really take a guess here. Is there, so maybe I should take a guess. How do you get involved, interested in sort of the, shall we say, forgotten or former sports teams and leagues thing? How does that sort of become enough of an interest that, and this I know it's been a while, this is just the new version of it, to encyclopedically chronicle all of such?
Well, for me, all of this really goes back to an interest in the history of the Cincinnati Reds. I was born and raised in Cincinnati. I still live in Cincinnati. Baseball is really the sport that I truly follow. When I was a kid, and we're talking about like 1970, I was about 9 years old, and I know that's really badly dating myself, but when I was a kid, my dad had no interest in sports whatsoever. He was a very interesting guy. He had all kinds of interests, but sports was definitely not one of them. And so we're talking about the days when, kids basically played outside all the time. And I had a bunch of friends in the neighborhood. And sometimes I would go to their houses and I would say, you want to come out and play? And they would say, no, I'm watching the Reds game with my dad right now. Do you want to come in and watch it with us? And I would always decline. I wasn't really interested. I hadn't been exposed to that very much. So one day I was at home, and I remember I was flipping through the TV channels, and it was like all 3 or 4 channels that we had at that time. And the Reds game was on one of them. And I thought to myself, I'm going to try watching this and see, what my friends find so intriguing about it. So I sat there and I started watching it, and I was kind of immediately interested in what was happening. And my mom was in the room with me. She must have been ironing or something. But I was watching this, not completely understanding the rules. I knew some of it, because we used to, was exposed to it with some of the other neighborhood kids. But I wouldn't always understand what happened. And so I would ask my mom, who was there, I would say something like, hey, Mom, this guy just caught the ball, and then the runner on third base was allowed to start running. Why? And she would say, oh, that's called a sacrifice fly. And she would explain the rule. And this happened throughout the game. I'm asking questions, and she's answering all of my questions. So a little while later on, the game was on again. I sat down to watch it again because I really had enjoyed it the first time. And this time my mom sat down and watched it with me. And once again, I'm full of questions, and she's full of answers. And this went on several times during that summer. And then finally I asked her, Mom, how do you know so much about baseball? And she told me that she had been a big Reds fan back in the 50s when she was a teenager. And she used to go to the games at Crosley Field all the time, and her favorite players were guys like Wally Post and Gus Bell and Frank Robinson. And she started to tell me stories about these days, and that got me interested in Reds history. So I started going to the school library, checking out any baseball books I could, especially books about the history of baseball. And eventually, she told me, the Reds were actually the first professional team ever. And that kind of blew me away. And by now I had been gaining a little baseball knowledge, and I said, no, that can't be true. It's got to be the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Giants or, the teams everybody talks about all the time. And she said, no, it was the Reds. They were the first. And so then I started to, be even more interested and look for books that were specifically about Reds history. Well, most of this went back to 1901, the era of modern baseball. And so I eventually, as years went on, was able to find things that went back to the 19th century and discovered that not only were the Reds the first professional team in 1869, and when they were called the Red Stockings, but they had actually existed since 1866 as an amateur team called the Resolutes, or the Resolute Baseball Club. And then I learned that a lot of the National League teams that were still in existence had played in the 1800s. And some of those teams, like the Los Angeles Dodgers, everybody pretty well knew that they had been the Brooklyn Dodgers, but who knew that they were called the Brooklyn Atlantics at one time? And that the Giants were not only the New York Giants, but originally the New York Gothams, and that the Phillies had been the Nationals and the Pirates were the Alleghenies. And so I really became interested in that and learning about these defunct leagues from the 1800s and some of these defunct teams, the Louisville Colonels and the Hartford Dark Blues. And so this was a passing interest of mine for years, and I would just read whatever I could. And it wasn't until probably the 1990s that I got the idea to maybe turn this into a book. So it was originally going to be a baseball book about baseball history, about these defunct teams, these defunct leagues, where these names came from. But honestly, I didn't think I had enough information to create a whole book out of it. And one day I was in the public library and I found a book that it was something about the origins of the names that all the existing teams in MLB, the NFL, the NBA, and the NHL. And so I checked that book out and I read it and I found it very interesting. And that got me thinking about these other sports and these other leagues and wondering what their histories might be like. And so I started delving into that and learning that there were all kinds of defunct football leagues, basketball leagues, hockey leagues, and teams. I eventually decided to expand the book and realized that that could be the perfect way to really fill it out and make it a complete book.
Okay, but at what point did you sort of, so you can make a book, but a reference book, I guess, to at least start, right, versus a narrative, right? But at what point, okay, so there's enough there for a book, but at what point as you start to pursue the process of putting this book together, right, which is probably part research and maybe even some interviews or some other investigation, at what point do you realize that this is such a large rabbit hole that it's probably not going to be neatly done very easily and very quickly?
Well, you're right about that because it took a lot of years, and we're talking about the 1990s, and so there was no internet yet. And
but there was microfiche. No?
Yeah, there was microfiche. So I was at the library a lot. I was on the phone a lot. I was looking for contact information, contacting other libraries because, I'm not that well off to where I can travel to other cities and just to do research. So I'm calling other libraries to try to do this research for me, and some of them would charge fees for doing the research, but as long as it was reasonable, I was willing to do that. But also some of the existing leagues at the time, I was contacting the league offices. I was contacting individual teams. Email was very helpful. And I got all kinds of very good responses, filling in all kinds of holes. But it was very labor intensive because of the era. To do the same research today would be much, much easier with the internet. But the first edition of this book came out in 2000. And so, like I said, most of the research was done in the 1990s, and it was a lot of work. It was more than I think I had counted on. But at a certain point, you're in the middle of it, and you're thinking, I can't give up now. It's, I got to get to the finish line. And that finish line was kind of a subjective thing, too, because at a certain point, I had so many years put into the research, I had to make a decision on, do I want to keep trying to add different sports and leagues to this, or, at what point do I want to decide that I'm finished?
Well, okay, maybe we can use that as a framing then. So what is the criteria? And then how do you go about sort of filling those in? I guess the first part of that question is to the title, right? How do you make that determination of what is, quote unquote, a major league? Because I'm sure there's some arbitrariness to that, depending on certain sports and maybe even eras of certain sports too.
Absolutely. And as I say in the introduction to this book, deciding whether a league is major or not is somewhat subjective, because there is no worldwide or nationwide criteria. So I had to create my own criteria. And so what I came up with was that a league, first of all, has to be professional. And there are different meanings of that word. But basically, to me, that means the players have to be paid. Secondly, it has to be at least to some degree national, meaning that it has to cross state lines at some point. And finally, it has to include the best players in its sport for that region, meaning whether it's a national league in the United States, it has to include the best players in the United States. Even if it's a specialized league, like the Negro leagues that are, confining themselves, not willfully necessarily, but to a specific segment of the population, or women's leagues, or the Senior Professional Baseball Association. They have to be the best players for that sport in that region. Part of that, too, is, and people have asked me, because in the first edition of the book, I would have included more sports if I had been able to more easily come up with the information that I needed. Now, that book contained 10 sports. The new edition of the book contains 22. And a lot of that was due to the fact that, as I said before, I had to decide whether I wanted to spend more and more years researching or stop with what I had and get the book published, which is ultimately what I did. And then as I started work on the second edition, decided that I could try to research some of those other sports now and some of those other leagues, and it was a much easier process because of the internet. And so that it was not nearly as difficult or as time-consuming. Now, that being said, there are still a lot of leagues, and some of the sports in this book were extremely difficult to track down. But as I worked on it, I was able to still contact a lot of people in a lot of leagues. They were very responsive. I think that was one of the nicer aspects of the whole project was the responsiveness of these teams and different people who were willing to help out.
Which was easier or harder? Was it finding lesser-known teams or leagues in sort of the established sports, like, say, I don't know, the Federal League in baseball, because baseball is such a well-documented sport generally that it was easier to find that stuff? Or perhaps is it maybe leagues or teams or, frankly, just outright defunct stuff in sports not generally associated with pro sports that you've nicely augmented in this edition? I mean, who knew there was a National Bowling League, although we had an episode a couple of months ago, and boxing and golf. I mean, very interesting, but curiosities to say the least, because we don't associate generally those sports with pro and or team play at all.
Right, and I'm always a fan of somebody who tries something new with an individual sport and tries to turn it into a team sport. I think that's kind of a fun enterprise, and I like to follow that. And to answer your question, I think it's a little of both, because with these older defunct teams, like you said, they are more popular sports, and there's a lot more history has been written and a lot more people who have done research on those. And standing on their shoulders makes it easier to find some things. But with some of the newer startup sports, for example, Ultimate Disc, there is no history. There is no professional history going back years and years of Ultimate Disc. It's a very new thing. And so everything that is happening in that sport is new and current. And as long as it's current, the information is there. You're able to track it. You're able to follow it. You're able to contact people if you need to, because the teams all still exist and the leagues still exist, and you don't have to go trying to track down past information. Now, with some of the other sports like cycling, one of the more difficult ones that I had was the National Cycle League. There's very little information printed about that. Even doing internet searches, you're not going to find a whole lot. And I was able to track down some isolated articles from various years that eventually allowed me to put the pieces of this puzzle together, and was also able to get in contact with one of the former cyclists who had some information in the way of programs and other things that he was able to copy and send to me. So some of the obscure ones, if they're new, they're still existing. It's easy. If it's something you're tracking down from the past, it can be very difficult.
How did you even find out about a National Cycle League in the first place? Like, how does it even hit your radar?
That I'm not even sure. I can't even remember how that came up. I must have been looking for something because sometimes some of these teams share names with other teams and other sports, and so it could have been that I was looking for a specific team in a different sport and came across one that had the same name in the National Cycle League. I can't remember exactly whether that happened, but I know there were some identical names, and that could be how that came about.
Are there any leagues generally in your work here that kind of stood out as being an especially interesting and intriguing and or surprising discovery or curiosity that you kind of wallowed in a little bit longer maybe than some of the others, that maybe especially that you weren't aware of or just had such craziness or oddities attached to it that just became its own intriguing sort of discovery?
One of the more fun ones that I discovered was called the United States Women's Polo Federation. So this is a professional polo league that started in 2001. It lasted until 2007. But along the way, they added a men's division. And so they changed the name of the league to the United States Women's Polo Federation / United States Men's Polo Federation. So there's a mouthful for the name of the league. But all the teams in this league, all the women's teams were named for dragonflies that were native to their respective locales. And all the men's teams were named for horse breeds. So that was kind of a fun thing, being able to discover, one of the things I started looking into was where the horse breed names came from. Because, a team called the Palm Beach Morgans, well, you can say it was named for a horse breed, but where did the name Morgan come from for a horse breed? So it was actually kind of fun looking up that kind of stuff, and I learned a lot about horses and, why certain breeds took on certain names. But that league also was very difficult to follow because I had discovered it when it was still playing, and very little was published about it, even when it was in existence. And so I found myself contacting the league over and over again, from season to season, just finding out what was going on, because certain teams were moving, they were expanding, certain teams were going defunct, and I probably bugged those people more than they appreciated, but they didn't show any signs of that. They were very cooperative, very helpful, and that's really the only way I was able to completely track that league was through personal contact.
Now that's interesting. So how much of that, though, how much of personal contact is part of your overall research, or was it largely contained to, shall we say, scholarly works or research in a more traditional sense, or did you kind of have to make up your own separate game plans? And frankly, how do you lay it all out? Do you have like a gigantic whiteboard or bulletin board, or I'm thinking 1990s era now, or spreadsheets, or how do you keep everything all sort of categorized and I don't know, diametrically, not diametric, what's the word I'm looking for? Mapped out and ensure that the trees and the branches are in the right places for all this stuff? Well,
yeah, you're talking 1990s, so talking about a lot of manila folders, separated out for different leagues or different sports or different whatever. All kinds of charts going on, arrows pointing to different things. Probably very, very messy. Today, like creating the second edition, not so much personal contact needed, because basically when a new league forms these days, they will announce the teams, and each team will announce its name and where it comes from and what it means. And all you have to do is look at the press releases, and you've got everything you need. But yeah, in the past, there was a lot more personal contact needed, and sometimes it would be a case of trying to make contact with individuals who were associated with teams that no longer existed or with leagues that no longer existed. So that could be a struggle. An example was that National Cycle League finally being able to, and I don't even remember how I got his name or his contact information, but that was kind of a lifesaver with that league. One of the leagues that I had a lot of personal contact with was World Team Tennis, and they are in existence today, but they also have a history that goes back pretty far. It goes back to the 1970s. And so trying to track down that information was a little challenging. And one of the things I was able to do was to locate some past yearbooks and purchase those, so I could find that stuff in different years. Then they'd have all the teams laid out. And but I was also spent some time on the phone with, I think it was Tracy Donnellan, and she was very cooperative. And I had reached a point where I had most of the information together, and I had a list of questions. And so I asked her if I could just fax her these questions and if she could fill in the blanks. I mean, just literally fill in the blanks in these questions, and she did that. And there were one or two things she didn't know, and she wrote on the fax, Billie Jean King suggests that you contact this person with this question. And so I was able to follow up on that contact and then fill in that gap. So that was very interesting and a very helpful process with that league.
All right, a quick pause from the proceedings, and let's get that first trivia question out of the way, shall we? Your chance to win a brand new copy of the brand new second edition book by our guest this week, Tom Brucato, Major Sports Leagues. That's the title. It's published by our friends at St. Johann Press, and the 500-page and then some hard copy version of this book is yours if you can be the first correct answer that we receive via email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We're going to use the sort of fastest finger first concept, meaning that the first correct answer that we get, and we'll timestamp them and stuff when we receive the email, to this trivia question, we'll then follow up with you and tell you won, and we'll get you your free copy sent to you straight away. And here's our first trivia question. It is, which nickname has been the most used by pro sports teams in history in the United States? What is the most used nickname, team nickname, in pro sports? And I'll give you a hint. I'll give you two that are often used, but is not the answer. The Thunder is one. We counted up by Tom Brucato's tallying here. Has been used 17 different times by professional sports teams across all the leagues. And another one is the Breakers, interestingly. Breakers has been used numerous times, I think 17 times. The USFL, as a matter of fact, used it 3 separate times. Arguably the same franchise, but in 3 different incarnations, with a team in Boston, and then New Orleans, and then in Portland, Oregon. But that's not the answer we're looking for. What is the nickname that has been most used by the most amount of teams in professional sports? If you're the first person with the correct answer, we will give you a copy of this book by Tom Brucato, Major Sports Leagues. And again, send your answer to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And the first correct answer that we receive to that question, yours is on the way. A copy of this book coming to you as a reward for listening. And we appreciate you continue to listen to our conversation with Tom. And here it comes. in some respects, this almost becomes, so I'm a huge pop music chart history guy, too. So in some respects, you've almost become the unwitting Joel Whitburn of the pro sports world. And Joel Whitburn is the sort of widely acknowledged expert and book producer and publisher of all kinds of various chart histories out there of music and stuff. So in some respects, this is almost like the Torah for me, and maybe for some of our listeners in terms of, I guess, the closest thing to definitiveness. Let me ask you this. Were there any leagues and or teams that, you kind of thought really hard about and whatever reasons didn't make the cut, and perhaps maybe why they didn't?
Yes. There were quite a few that didn't make the cut, but it usually didn't take much to find out that usually it was a case of the league not being professional. There's one that didn't make it, and I can't, it's kind of a strange story. I don't even remember the name of the league. I do remember that it was a roller hockey league. And I had discovered the name of this league, and there were a whole bunch of teams, and it had a history, and it was still in existence. And so I started kind of digging into the history of this league and trying to kind of get a leg up on it. I went ahead and contacted like the first 3 existing teams on my list to see if they could tell me where their names came from. And so I sent 3 emails to 3 different teams just as a start, but I'm still, doing other research on, the years and the teams and any relocations and all that kind of information. And the first email came back from one of these teams, and it was, I think, from the general manager of the team. And he said, why do you want to know this information? And I had explained in my initial email that this was for a book and tried to explain it. And so I emailed back and said that again. And he came back and he said, well, I'm not really sure if I should provide you with this information. I'll think about it and get back to you. And I thought, well, that's really strange. And then the second team responded and said pretty much the same thing. It was, we're not sure we should provide any information about this to you. And then the third team was the same thing. It was almost like the same person, even though it was 3 completely different teams in 3 completely different cities, 3 completely different contacts, or so it seemed. And eventually I was able to dismiss this league because it turned out to be semi-pro at best and amateur at worst. It was kind of a mixture of amateur and semi-pro. So the league didn't get included, but I, to this day, have no idea of where the paranoia was coming from over the team names. I don't know if they were afraid I was looking into trademark infringement maybe or something like that. I have no idea. But it was a very strange experience.
I'm guessing this was sort of in the ashes of what used to be Roller Hockey International, and then for a year or two, Major League Roller Hockey, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of episodes, one with our pal Richard Neil Graham, and one with the guru of Challenger Leagues, Dennis Murphy, about some of that stuff. And it does seem like there was, as I suspect that every new league that with a new pro sort of team circuit kind of thing, for whatever reason, if it doesn't last, sort of it there's always sort of a hardy band of folks that want to keep it going in some kind of, maybe if not established and significant amateur fashion, maybe some semi-pro like way to someday perhaps, like say Major League Soccer coming out of the ashes of various semi-pro efforts after the death of the North American Soccer League, right? There's always sort of that hope and that belief that the sport, perhaps because of timing, because of unique financial issues, or just the market not being ready, that kind of stuff. Like, for example, I would imagine some of the more intriguing ones, like pro cricket, right? Which is a relatively new thing from 2004. It was only 1 year. And I think I actually have found one of the owners or the co-creators or founders of that. He works sort of in tech, and I've not got any responses yet. But that's, that year and that effort, right, playing in minor league baseball parks and stuff, and you just know how cricket in various forms, especially sort of the speedier sort of shortened version of that is, it's huge in various parts of the world, India in particular, and all the diaspora of Indian expatriates around the world, right? So you can imagine that, the United States could be yet again another opportunity for cricket under the right circumstances. But I got to think there are a lot of sports where the pro thing is experimented with or makes its debut, and then it kind of just falters and then sort of either goes back into amateurism or something like it. I mean, I think bowling was a really good example. That one to me was a huge revelation a couple of months ago. The early 1960s when the National Bowling League came about. It was basically that versus the Pro Bowlers Association, which became kind of the mechanism by which pro bowling really wound up becoming a sustainable prize-centric thing. It became more of a tour-centric thing versus a team-based thing. But there's a period of time there where it could have very well been a pro-team kind of circuit. And, for a year and a half, it was, at least competitively, attempted to be such.
Yeah.
Do you sense that there are other leagues that somehow elude you? I'm guessing you're probably keeping the door open to continuing to sort of keep this idea and extensive research kind of alive, almost as the authoritative reference going forward, now that you've kind of gotten to this point, no?
Yes, and sometimes I just will randomly search for different sports, and I believe there may be a professional swimming league starting soon, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to be keeping a watch on that. But another thing that you have to do when you have these new sports starting up is, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying about how do you determine a major league, is to not really compare it to, today's big four. I mean, Major League Baseball, the NFL, NBA, NHL. And somebody did ask me, at least on one occasion, how in the world can you compare this league and call it a major league when, if you look at the NFL, it's nowhere close to, popularity or money or anything. And one of the things that I do is to not compare up to those leagues, but to try to compare them more closely to, say, the National Association of 1871 or even the National League of 1876, because if you look at those leagues and those teams, very few of those players were able to make a living year-round on what they made playing baseball. They had to take odd jobs in the off season. Sometimes they would work at bars and restaurants when they were at home in the summer. So as long as they're getting paid, the players, it doesn't mean that they have to be able to completely make a living at that sport. And I think we have to treat these new sports the way baseball was treated, the way we treat baseball of the 1800s.
Okay, I got a couple of questions here, because there's also some notable omissions here, at least, but that's perhaps on my sort of framing of maybe what a pro league is, and maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of the calculus, I guess, that you sort of approached when considering these leagues. And I guess the first I would sort of throw out to you is arena football. Not in there. Why not?
Arena football is in there.
I'm sorry, that's my mistake. I was looking under football. But okay. But maybe we could.
Yeah, it's a separate category.
No, got it. And I guess that's probably the answer I was looking for. How about the World League of American Football in the 1990s?
If I'm not mistaken, that was a European league, right?
Yeah, but it had a few U.S.-based teams for a couple of years. And I clearly, a lot of what you focus on is on the North American side of things. But there were a couple of teams domiciled in the United States. But I guess perhaps you feel that that's more of an international kind of approach, and that kind of falls outside of the boundaries here.
It does. I consider, having a team or two from North America to me isn't enough. It has to be a North American-based league. That's just, one of the criteria that I have established for myself to kind of keep the reins on things.
No, I get it. And then two other ones from the realm of women's sports, right? So one of which I can understand, I think, because it was so obscure to me, was the national. Maybe you're unaware of it, but 2 weeks ago we had an episode, the National Women's Football League, the 70s and early 1980s. The Houston Hurricanes, HERRICANAS, which is semi-pro, I guess, to some extent. And the other is, which I think is actually a bit more interesting, is the Women's Basketball League, or I guess at the time it was called the Women's Professional Basketball League of the late 70s, early 80s. Teams like the New Jersey Gems and the Iowa Cornets. We've had Molly Kazmer otherwise known as Molly Bolin, on our show. She was a sort of a standout star in that. But I guess there's cutoffs there, right? You've got to sort of make the decisions about what to include and say perhaps what not to include.
Yeah, that's true. And I do know that I looked into that women's football league that you mentioned, and somewhere along the line decided that it didn't quite fit all of the criteria. I don't know if that's because it was more semi-pro than pro. I can't really recall. The basketball league, I don't recall at all, so I don't know if I've even been aware of that one.
Perhaps we can help you with your third edition then. Yeah,
maybe.
It was known as the WBL. Was in the late 70s, 1978, 79. There's the New York Stars, which featured, they call them the Dannon twins. They're the two twin ladies who were part of a Dannon yogurt commercial campaign. They played for the New York Stars. Machine Gun Molly Bolin, who was kind of a sexy pinup type as well as an amazing basketball player. Yeah, I think a lot of people actually would look at the ABL and then obviously the WNBA. They look a lot at the WBL of the late 70s, early 80s as being kind of the beginnings of that. Iowa had like 6,000-7,000 people a game for that. But let me throw out some other things. So where else do you think that perhaps you could expand this, or do you think you've got enough by just keeping it sort of under its current definitions? Right? Because you could make arguments, for example, that now what today would be known as minor leagues, right, could through certain lens be sort of included in sort of a major league sport, such as the Pacific Coast League in baseball back in, say, the 1950s, 1960s, right before Major League Baseball expanded to the West Coast and, San Francisco and LA and that kind of stuff. A lot of people, baseball historians, arguably look at the PCL as being almost as equivalent to major leagues, and simply because there were only 12 or 14 teams, mostly in the East Coast and in the Midwest. But what of, say, the CBA, the Continental Basketball Association, which, again, minor league by today's traditional, definitions, but in many respects, I think a lot of people felt that the CBA was the second best professional basketball league in the world at that time, and that, is saying something given that there are plenty of leagues in Europe and South America and stuff, or even today's G League, right, which is obviously the minor league feeder to the NBA. I guess I know the answer to that, but would you ever consider making some unique exceptions to maybe some of these leagues that on a good day would be confused with professional, or would they just not qualify because they're not the ultimate top tier in their respective sports? Yeah,
they would not qualify for that reason. To some extent, I have to follow traditional historians' opinions and popular feelings or definitions that this is a minor league. And in terms of exceptions, I think that I have already made exceptions in terms of, for example, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Was that really a major league? Well, if you read a book about Major League Baseball history, you're not going to find that in there. But the fact that they were the best women playing baseball, I think, does qualify it. Same with the Negro Leagues. These guys were many of them definitely of major league caliber, and they even had their own minor league teams. And I think that kind of a structure qualified the highest Negro Leagues for inclusion. Teams that are leagues that are traditionally called minor leagues, I just kind of struggle with that. And I think in terms of the scope of the book, the direction that I would take in the future would be more towards looking towards other new sports that are starting up, or not necessarily a new sport, but a sport that is newly forming a professional league.
Some of the stuff in here is, it's cool. You've sort of categorized it and sort of sliced it and diced it in different manners. But the team names in particular, and frankly, you have a good third of the book is focused on sort of the origins of a lot of these team names. Any team names that struck you as odd, interesting, unique, or just kind of just burnished in your memory that you couldn't shake and you couldn't believe maybe, or maybe you just didn't know where the name came from and you were pleasantly or oddly surprised by the origin of that team name?
Well, there are kind of a whole lot of those, and I have to say that I learned a lot about geography and history and different cities and different landmarks. I learned a lot by researching these team names, and to me, that's the most fun part of the book, because that's not so much reference book. I mean, that's something you could actually sit down and read and hopefully enjoy that part of it. I think one of the more interesting ones that I found and learned about was the Lancaster Roses, which was a basketball team. And I learned about, and if you're from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, this is probably no big deal to you, but I had no idea of the connection between Lancaster and the house in England that it was named for, and the same with York, Pennsylvania, and the house in England that it was named for. And the fact that Lancaster had used the red rose as its symbol and York had used the white rose as its symbol. And this struggle for the throne over in England led to what was called the War of the Roses. So I would have never connected the name of this basketball team, the Lancaster Roses, with this historical event, the War of the Roses. But that is exactly the truth, that this team, because Lancaster, Pennsylvania, has adopted the red rose as its symbol based on its counterpart in England, and that York has adopted the white rose. It was probably something I learned in grade school, but I learned a lot about the War of the Roses and England. Other names, like it was kind of almost comical to see some of the earlier teams being named for the businesses that sponsored them, or if the owners also own businesses. I'm thinking of a team like the Washington Laundrymen. Who roots for a team called the Laundrymen? That was kind of entertaining. The Saskatoon Sheiks, an old hockey team that was named for the song "The Sheik of Araby." There were a lot of surprises, a lot of entertainment, and a lot of education that went into that discovery.
All right, trivia time. One last time before we go to the rest of this interview with our pal Tom. And here it is. Again, this is your chance to win a free copy of the awesome tome, Major Sports Leagues, by our guest Tom Brucato. Again, brought to you courtesy of our friends at St. Johann Press. And here is the question. Again, it's fastest finger first, so to speak. That is the first correct answer that we get via email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We'll win a free copy, and we'll make sure that we get all the information that we need to get that copy of the book sent directly to you. And here is that question. Name for me all of the franchises of the league known as the Major League Volleyball circuit. Major League Volleyball, or MLV. It is a league that ran from 1987 to 1989, and I need to hear all of the teams that were the franchises in Major League Volleyball. I'm not talking about the International Volleyball Association. I'm not talking about of the 70s. I'm not talking about any other incarnation. It's Major League Volleyball from 1987 to 1989. I want all the team names. There's not a whole lot of them. And I'll give you a hint. One of those teams was in 3 different cities in each of those 3 seasons. The other ones were stable. So there you go. I need the names of all of the franchises of Major League Volleyball from the late 1980s. Again, fastest finger first, hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. The winner will get a free copy of this great new book, this great reference tome, Major Sports Leagues, by our pal, Tom Brucato. Here is the rest of our conversation coming at you. Any risque ones, or ones that either double meanings, or ones that maybe wouldn't pass muster in today's more politically correct world? Like for example, I look at one looks at the Atlanta Crackers, right? And obviously that is can be considered a charged word in racial terms, I guess, maybe not sort of directly, but when you look into the definition of that, it actually came down to something about sort of horse and buggy operators who would, quote unquote, crack the whip. And that was sort of the original intention of the name, but, domiciling a team named the Crackers in Atlanta, the heart of the South. Interesting, line walking, I guess, I would argue, and maybe some sort of history of I guess, tolerance in this country and the Redskins thing, right, and Indians and the Native American thing, right? I mean, there's a whole sort of host of things that might not have been perceived to be a big deal back in the day or in their respective areas, but against the lens of time and or broader geographies, might be more questionable. That's a sort of a theme that I guess I sort of see and hear in my sort of flipping through these pages.
Yeah, the only one that I can think of, other than those racial references that you mentioned, and which have, kind of come and gone, and why they were, considered acceptable is a whole nother question. But the only one I can think of is the Miami Hooters, and they were named, after Hooters restaurants, which, the name of the restaurants is kind of a risque one. But they always go with the owl theme, and they named their team after the restaurant. So that's really the only one that comes to mind that, other than having a racial reference.
All right. Any other things that, you just sort of rejected out of hand? I can imagine, for example, the Lingerie Football League, albeit teams that actually played. Now I think it's called the Legends Football League, and maybe even actually on hiatus now. But, they were actual teams. They had television exposure and other exposure, if you could, sold tickets, right? But, you get to squint really hard, per se, I guess, to consider it a quote-unquote pro women's football league, right? I don't, maybe that's the answer to that. Maybe you didn't even consider them in the first place. Any others that might have sort of fallen into that category too?
Well, the one you mentioned, I did struggle with. That was that, and I can't say, to this day that I made the right decision in excluding it, but it just didn't seem like something that was meant to be taken very seriously from a sports standpoint. I think that's ultimately why I ended up rejecting it. The other ones that I struggled with were there are two martial arts leagues in there, and I struggled with them for personal reasons, not because of what they were. There were two leagues in there. One's called the International Fight League, and the other is the World Combat League. And in terms of martial arts, I am a martial artist. I've been a martial artist for 45 years. And my philosophy has always been the traditional one of, the martial arts are for self-defense, defense of the weak, and for making yourself a better person. And in martial arts circles, I've always been kind of a minority in that I am completely against tournaments. I think that they fly in the face of that philosophy. When I was at a karate school, when I first got my black belt, the school had been focused on that philosophy, and for some reason, right after I got my black belt, the Korean master at that school announced that we were going to be entering tournaments now. You didn't have to. Anybody who wanted to would be sponsored in these tournaments. And the whole focus of the school shifted from this, original philosophy to, hey, we got to win these trophies. And it was not a good thing to see. I mean, it was to the point where even in practice sparring, the quote-unquote referee would say, no, you can't use that move. That would be a penalty in a tournament. And I would think to myself, well, I'm not training for a tournament. I'm training for the real thing. So if I was on the street, I would totally use that. So I struggled from that perspective with including these two leagues because they are very much practicing what I found personally offensive about using the martial arts. And I eventually came to the realization that I had to put my personal feelings aside because they did really meet the criteria for the book. And so if I wanted the book to be, truly what I wanted to be, I couldn't get personal about that. So that was a struggle, but they're in there.
And roller derby didn't make the cut either, I think probably for obvious reasons, but maybe you could tell our audience maybe why roller derby doesn't sort of qualify given the fact that there are teams like the Bombers and others that are, seemingly passed off as a professional league.
Well, the roller derby that I had always experienced was very much staged. And to me, that's not what we're looking for in sports. I mean, it was entertainment, certainly. It was physical, certainly. There were games, but any kind of staging whatsoever to me makes it not fitting the criteria.
All right, I got one last one for you that's sort of on the cusp, and it may actually be another sort of potential inclusion in, dare I say, the third edition. What I think it was called the National Wrestling League, and obviously it's not the same from the WWE and sort of the admittedly staged and spectacle that is pro wrestling. But I do sense that if I remember correctly, it's completely hazy in my mind, and maybe our audience can weigh in too. I think it was in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, where it was an actual pro wrestling circuit in the, I don't know if it was Greco-Roman or some other sort of, legit kind of, NCAA kind of formatted thing with pro teams. It didn't last very long. And again, that may not sort of rise to the level of your criteria, but I think it was the first and really only kind of attempt to do true professional wrestling in a legit sense and actually in team form. And I do know there was a team in Chicago. I think they played in the Rosemont Horizon or some other environment that was way too big. But, in the Midwest, obviously college wrestling is a huge thing. And I throw that out there as perhaps maybe, and there are probably some others. I'm sure after this episode, we're going to get plenty of input from people who think they've got you, or perhaps want to suggest to you opening.
And they may.
Some new ones. Well, okay. But it sounds to me though that this doesn't feel like it's ever maybe going to be a finished project, is it?
No, I call it a living work because that's exactly what it is. I mean, you never know from one day to the next what's going to happen. One of the things that made it easier for me to go from the first edition to the second edition is that I never stopped the research. Once the first edition got published, I kept a working copy of the entire manuscript on my computer and kept it updated no matter what was changing. And so at the time I'm adding these 12 new sports to the book, I'm also keeping up with the 10 original sports that were included. And so I did not have to go back 20 years and say, okay, let's look at the original book and see what has changed since that time. And so now that the second edition is out, I will continue to keep a working copy and continue to keep it updated. So hopefully there may be a third edition someday.
So I'm curious as to sort of themes, right? Were there any, as you continue to research all this stuff and even expand into other sports in the second edition, were there patterns or themes that sort of kept emerging over and over again that, that kind of maybe sort of gave you even more of an understanding of sort of the whys and hows of these sports and leagues and their comings and goings?
Well, one of the things that I have kind of noticed is that when one of these new sports crops up and decides to try a professional league, there are a lot of cases where a second one will start up almost right on the tails of the first. And they will either end up merging or end up killing each other. And I'm not sure why that happens, but I've seen it in a number of occasions where, this new sport, this could be great, and yet all of a sudden an opposing league starts up almost immediately, and they kind of cancel each other out.
Yeah, we saw that with the rebirth of professional soccer in the United States in the late 60s. There were actually 3 leagues. They, cooler heads prevailed. There were only 2 when there were none the year before in 1967. And then they had to merge in 68. And by 69, there were only like 5 teams left. So, it's too much of a good thing in a short period of time. Here's the other question, though, and this is more modern and more future-facing. And frankly, maybe even shaped by today's headlines and maybe what's ahead in the macroeconomic sense in the months and years to come. I even said this before, the current coronavirus situation and the economic impact that's also brought to the world, frankly. And it just felt like to me, it has felt like to me for some time that, you wonder just how far and how peak pro sports is and can go, right? I'm the biggest soccer fan on the planet, right? But 30 teams in Major League Soccer. $500 million for yet another expansion franchise in the NHL. While Las Vegas was successful, you've got at least 3 or 4 teams that are, not really sort of solid, like in the Phoenix, Arizona area, for example. How much revenue is there to be had? The salaries and the exorbitant prices of tickets and all that kind of stuff, right? So I guess I wasn't sort of maybe hoping for it, but you may be uniquely qualified to sort of answer this question, right? Given all this research and all the stuff around leagues no longer with us and teams certainly no longer with us. I don't know. Does this sort of continue to go on and just become a endless source of merriment for both you as a book writer and me as a podcaster, or is there a correction or perhaps a cyclicality to some of this stuff? And, maybe there is a trimming or a more rational, sober narrowing perhaps of what exists today, which, fueled by television, there's a lot of stuff out there, right? I don't know how thinly you can slice the entertainment pie, especially maybe now that there'll be fewer dollars maybe to spend in the next number of years.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I think as an example, I'll use Major League Soccer. I remember when Major League Soccer started up, they had 8 or 10 teams. I can't remember exactly, but they were very slow to expand, and most of these new startup leagues, they'll start expanding very quickly. And then very quickly they find themselves unable to keep up with everything, and they end up folding. In the case of Major League Soccer, they started up and they maintained the same number of teams for kind of a long time, and I think that really helped their stability, just from what I've observed with these different leagues. And now they're expanding like crazy now, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm glad that we have a team here in Cincinnati now. They just started up last year. I think one of the keys to stability is to kind of limit yourself, at least at first, and not try to move too fast. And that's what MLS did, and that might be one of the reasons they've been so successful. But whether all these big leagues can sustain all this forever, I don't know. It's a really good question, because it's never been this big before.
Alrighty then, our thanks to Tom Brucato, and the name of the book is Major Sports Leagues. It's the second edition of this amazing reference book. It's almost 500 pages deep. It is published by our friends at St. Johann Press, and it will be available on Amazon and all those other great bookstores. I think it'll be delayed, of course, as we drop this episode. I think we're still in the midst of Amazon prioritizing the more important things out there, whether it's food and other sort of basic essentials, as we all collectively struggle through our trying times. But absolutely, you can order a copy of that book there. We'll have a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Tom Brucato and you'll see it. And you can also order it directly from the St. John's Press website. That's St. John's Press. That's STJOHANN Press, PRESS.com. St. Johann or Johann Press.com. I don't even know if there's a silent J or not, but hopefully you'll figure it out. And you can order a copy directly that way. And I think our pal Dave Bissell there will maybe even give you a little discount for doing so. Regardless, hopefully you find a way to get a copy of the book. It's fantastic, and it will looks very smart on your reference library shelf, and make you the envy of everybody in your social circles, at least in a distant form, in terms of your adding to your sports knowledge, while we all keep to ourselves in trying times, for sure. Let's see. We also, of course, remind you that our website is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That is the place where you can send your friends if they're new to this concept, if they don't understand podcasting or whatever, if they want to tool around and see our over 160 episodes now and counting of shows, if they're looking for a little diversion, a little whimsy, a little something to keep their minds and ears occupied while the weight of the world kind of presses upon them, and they're into sports and they're missing sports in their lives, well, maybe there's a little interesting stuff there to be found, and they'll learn some stuff too while they're at it. Obviously, you can find us on any podcast catcher or feed. Just search us up. We're in just about every library you can find in every directory, and download us and bookmark us and make sure that you're catching our every single week's episode to not miss a thing. GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com is also the place to check out all the other stuff we've got going on. You want our social feeds and follow us that way, by all means. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. That's all one word. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. That's also all one word. There's a Facebook page devoted to us as well. And of course, you can send us email directly, whether it's a contest entry, as you heard earlier in the show. If you skip through it, well, you better skip back and get a chance to win a copy of Tom's book. But our email address for that, as well as any general inquiries, and that's at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can also, on our website, check us out by subscribing to our weekly email newsletter that we'd like to send out every Saturday or Sunday, depending on how things are going. I give you a little bit of an advance warning about what each week's episode to come is going to be. One last thanks, of course, to our pal Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. I don't know, maybe we should do a listener contest as to perhaps what he could name his newly formed independent podcast and production and audio services firm. I like to think House of Pain might be interesting. Get it? Wink, wink. There's some other things out there, so why not? Who knows? I'm not sure he's looking for a name, but whatever. We got to thank Jerry tremendously. He's been at it for us for now almost 3 years, and we can't do it without him. We appreciate his services for sure, whatever he's calling himself. And again, we want to stress to all of you out there, first of all, thank you for listening. We appreciate it. But more importantly, please do all the things that you need to do to stay safe and healthy. It's important and crucial that you do. If you think you're fine, you may not be. You may be carrying the virus and you don't know it. I think you all have to sort of think now that maybe you kind of already have it, and what can you do to prevent others from getting it? And by all means, too, please keep each other supported and comforted, because not everybody is in maybe good positions as you might be. And frankly, there are a lot of other people out there who are not. And it's important we all get through this together. We appreciate our little club, circling around and keeping each other sort of uplifted and connected. And by all means, take a little bit of that and share that with others, too, outside of our little circle here. We appreciate that, and they will, too. Please stay safe, stay healthy. God bless, and God willing, we'll be back next week with another, hopefully, fun-filled episode of Distraction for you. And until then, please, indeed, by all means, take care, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Bye-bye.